of the West Virginia Center on Climate Change. And we'd like to welcome everyone to the third of our three-part series this summer on putting together a just transition. We've had a speaker talk about federal national policy. We've had a speaker talk about state and regional policy. And tonight we're going to get perspectives on just transitions from the local communities and community capacity to deal with some of the challenges and difficulties that we face here in West Virginia. We're proud to put on this program. We are the West Virginia Center on Climate Change. We are co-sponsored throughout this three-part series by the West Virginia College of Law Center for Energy and Sustainable Development and the West Virginia Climate Alliance. Today, our featured speaker will be West Virginia University Assistant Professor Jame Shin, who will be speaking for about 15 minutes or so about her research in community resilience, flooding, and how the flooding may be affecting local community ability to deal with new crises such as COVID. We're joined tonight with two panelists who will introduce more formally later, but we do have Angie Rosser of the West Virginia Rivers Coalition and Nicolas Zegre, who is an associate professor of Forest Hydrology at West Virginia University. We greatly appreciate everyone attending. This is an interactive program that we do have a question and answer box, so please feel free to type in any questions that you have for either our speaker or the panelists, or about the subject of community resilience and capacity. And we'll get to those after our speaker and our panelists have an opportunity to talk. And we are respectful and mindful of your time. So we should be done around 8 o'clock, which is the hour that we have scheduled for this program. So at this time, I would like to introduce our main speaker for the evening. I'll ask our panelists to perhaps mute their cameras for right now. And Jame Shin, as I said, is an assistant professor of geography here at West Virginia University. Her current research focus is on community resilience, both in southern West Virginia, as well as communities in Africa, and the way that humans respond to critical situations such as extreme weather and flooding, which are coming about as a result of climate change. Dr. Shinn is also a member of the West Virginia Climate Change Professional Development Project, a collaboration between science communicators, media consultants, social activists, and educators to work with West Virginia teachers on climate science and communication. And we at the center are very interested in communications and spreading accurate scientific knowledge about climate change. So we're welcome Dr. Shinn for her presentation, and probably we'll be asking her about that afterwards. So at this point, Dr. Shinn, take it away.
Okay, and can you hear me okay, Michael?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Michael, for that introduction and for the invitation to be here this evening. And thanks to all of you who are Zooming in from home. I appreciate you taking some time on your Tuesday evening to be with us. So as Michael said, I'm Jame Shin. I'm an assistant professor in the Geology and Geography department at WVU. And and let me just share my screen so that you can see. I'll trust someone to tell me. Oh, wait, that's not what I want, sorry. I think at this point in the pandemic, I would have zoomed down.
They're good, Dr. Shinn.
Is that this? Are you seeing the slides, Michael?
No, actually, I'm not. They were up for a moment.
All right. I know we had it working beforehand. Okay, now are you seeing the slides?
Yes, ma'am, I sure am.
Great,
looks
thanks,
good.
Michael. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm a geographer, and my research centers around, like Michael said, the social impacts of and adaptation to climate change, especially in relation to flooding events. And in my work, I used mainly qualitative methods, things like interviews, focus groups, and even photography, which I'll talk about a little bit later, to understand the experiences of people and communities who are living in changing and often very unpredictable environments. I also work in collaboration with folks that use a lot of quantitative and modeling-based methods, including Nico. So I'm glad he's here tonight and that we'll have a chance to dialogue about some of this. In my research, I'm interested in what the scholar Jesse Rebo calls the pre-hazard precarity of people. In other words, I start with the assumption that people are not vulnerable to an extreme climate event just because of the event itself. They are vulnerable because of a myriad of structural issues, which may have very little to do with a flooding event or other natural hazard, but is more aptly tied to things like socioeconomic factors, including race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, and the list goes on. And we don't have to look any further than the recent news articles that you see on the screen here. These are articles published in the last few months, all in 2021 from National Public Radio and the New York Times. I'm happy to pass along links, or it might be that we can throw links in the chat even to any of these articles if people are interested. They all speak to this idea of structural vulnerabilities to flooding, particularly in climate change in general. I'll just highlight the top one from yesterday's front page NPR website, which talks about the fact that HUD has been selling homes that are known to be located in the floodplain at a cheap cost to low-income families. And the result of this process is what you can see in that photo right there, right? Those are homes that were sold by our federal government to low-income people known to be in floodplains. So I'm interested in asking questions about this type of process, and I'm most interested in exposing the sources of vulnerability and identifying possibilities for transformation that could lead to more equitable climate futures. So this evening, I'll talk about some of my work in West Virginia to show you what I've been learning alongside communities about their vulnerability to climate change. And then I'll talk a little bit about how I've begun to think about intersections between that work and this idea of a just energy transition here in West Virginia and elsewhere. And again, I'll try to keep my comments fairly brief because I'm particularly interested to discuss some of this with Angie and Nico and with all of you. So this is a picture of me on the left from probably about 10 years ago, interviewing a household displaced by flooding in the Okavango Delta of Botswana, located on this map you can see here of Southern Africa in the country of Botswana, where I did my doctoral research. In 2011, this massive inland delta experienced extremely high flooding events that disproportionately impacted already marginalized groups. And in my dissertation research, I worked with these groups, including single female-headed households and members of one particular ethnic group that live in the region that was already marginalized. And I was continuing this work out of my dissertation when I arrived at WVU in the summer of 2016, just as massive floods hit our state. And at that time, a colleague who has since left WVU for another university, Martina Corretta, invited me to join her for some field work about the floods down in Greenbrier County. And when we went down for that field work, I was particularly struck by how many similarities I could see between my work in Botswana and the way people were talking about the impacts of the floods in places like White Sulphur Springs and Raynell. And so that began my work here in West Virginia. And since that time, I've been applying many of the same questions that I had been asking in Southern Africa within the context of Southern West Virginia. And I'm happy to talk about my work from Africa at another time or in the Q&A, but I want to spend the rest of my time tonight talking about what I've been doing here in our state. So I don't need to remind anyone on this call, I'm sure, of the 2016 floods and the disastrous toll that they took. But we know they killed 23 people, destroyed thousands of homes and businesses, and caused more than $1 billion in damages across the state. And as you likely know, despite extensive support from state, federal, nonprofit sources, rebuilding efforts are still going on over 5 years later in many of these towns as they continue to struggle to make a full recovery. And we know that across the United States, including here in West Virginia, we expect to see increased flooding events in the future as a result of intensifying climate change. And we know that already vulnerable communities will face particularly difficult challenges responding to and effectively adapting to these events. So in 2017, our team began conducting interviews with people impacted by the floods or who were involved directly in flood recovery efforts in Raynell and White Sulphur Spring. And we know that this region was already deeply vulnerable before the floods, right? In many ways, they're a microcosm of the story we often tell of Appalachia. The decline of local timber and coal industries has resulted in high rates of unemployment, outmigration, opioid addiction. You know this story, right? And in Raynell in particular, over 35% of the town's population live below the federal poverty line. But in addition to these very real and pertinent sources of vulnerability, our research also revealed sources of resilience in the face of this disaster. What this looked like in practice was neighbors helping neighbors to muck out one another's homes, right? Often helping neighbors before they mucked out their own home after the floods. It looked like a little girl from a neighboring county delivering melted ice cream cones to people repairing their homes from the back of her parents' pickup truck, right? Just because she wanted to do something to help. More broadly, it looked like hundreds, if not more, volunteers coming to assist with rebuilding and recovery, especially we found from faith-based organizations like the Mennonite Disaster Service and the Appalachian Service Project, who had a presence in Greenbrier County for years after the floods, rebuilding people's homes, in some cases building them brand new homes, repairing bridges, etc. We found that these organizations and other volunteer groups that arrived to assist with flood recovery did more, though, than just rebuild homes and repair infrastructure. They seemed to spark a sense of hope for future revitalization efforts, and it spurred residents to think about rebuilding in a way that was transformative, in a way that made their towns stronger, more resilient than they were before the floods hit. And in this article, the first one you see here, which is available from Southeastern Geographer, which is a journal, I'm happy to also just send PDFs to anybody who is interested. We argue that this is a more complex story than the one that's commonly told about Appalachia, one about vulnerability and resiliency existing side by side, right, in the same community, in the same household. I think this type of dynamic becomes really important as we consider how to think about helping communities respond to future disasters. And we can think, and you can find out even more about this from another collaborative piece that we wrote with Nico, who I think may want to talk about this article that was just published in Frontiers in Water, that talks about kind of a holistic approach to thinking through these from both the climate modeling side with kind of qualitative work alongside that. And again, happy to send PDFs of these articles to anybody. So in May of 2020, with a grant from the WVU Humanities Center, I began an extension of my work on the flooding in Greenbrier County. This new project built on this notion of the coexistence of resiliency and vulnerability, and asked residents of Raynell to document their experiences with a very different type of disaster, the COVID-19 pandemic. To do this, I used a method that's known as Photovoice, in which I sent participants very small digital cameras to capture their lived experiences during the pandemic. This allowed me a really unique opportunity to qualitatively understand people's experiences literally through their own eyes in a time when face-to-face research that I would typically do was impossible because of the pandemic. In the end, about 10 people actively took photos. They took about 850 images over the course of 4 months in fall of 2020. So just about a year ago, they were taking these photos. And one of the most striking themes to emerge from these photos, and follow-up conversations about those photos kind of further told the story, is not the focus participants placed on the immediate impacts of the pandemic in the way that we were hearing about in the news, but rather how the pandemic slowed down ongoing flood recovery efforts. And I just want to show you one example. So all of the photos from here on out are photos taken by participants as part of the project. And here's Raynell from a distance, just so you get a sense of where it's located. And the other photo is of a sidewalk, right, on Main Street in Raynell, downtown. And you probably wouldn't think much of this photo if you just happened to see it. But when I asked the person who took it why they included it, they told me a really interesting story. Raynell had gotten a grant to repair some infrastructure that in part had been damaged by floods. So sidewalks were part of that. And they had a grant to do all of Main Street. But as many of us experienced, when the pandemic hit, the cost of supplies skyrocketed, right? So cement, lumber, these type of things become much more expensive. And so they were only able to finish half of the sidewalk that they had intended to do with the grant that they had, right? Here's this really tangible example of an intersection of disaster, right? In this kind of slow, drawn out way, the flood and the pandemic. During a focus group with my participants this past June, when I was finally able to travel down to see them in person, one of them described how the pandemic and the flood were a double whammy of disaster. And I thought that was a really eloquent way to talk about it. So I'm currently working with these folks to put together a photo exhibit from the project. One will be held in Raynell and one on WVU's campus. We're waiting for the current COVID surge we seem to be in to slow down so that it feels safe to do this, but stay tuned. I hope some of you will attend that. And here are just a few more photos and a quote from a participant that, again, are kind of making these linkages between flooding and the pandemic. And you just can kind of see the ways in which people were capturing life at that time. These findings on flood vulnerability have also opened up a new opportunity that I know Michael is also working on, as well as other folks on the call. Nico's been very involved, as has Angie, with the Bridge Initiative for Science and Technology Policy, which is a new university-wide initiative on campus. I was lucky to be named one of the inaugural fellows for this program and for me, it's really exciting because I think it's a way to merge the land grant mission of the university with the research mission of the university. And what the fellowship is intended to do is to help faculty translate their research into viable policy options for the state. And so I'm having this unique opportunity right now to think through how could qualitative data like these photos, like these stories, be used to convince policymakers that we need better protection for flooding, and to think about things like climate change more generally. And I have been particularly thinking about this in relation to new initiatives coming out of Washington, D.C. related to environmental justice, the infrastructure package that we've all heard about, and of course, energy transitions, all of which I think will have significant implications for rural Appalachian communities like the ones I've been working in. So how does this all fit into this idea of just energy transitions? I believe that and this is where I'll close and turn it over to everyone else. I believe that a just transition to a sustainable energy economy is not just about the future. It is not just about jobs. It is about those things, but it also has to be about addressing structural vulnerabilities that result from decades of the social and environmental toll of extractive industries. And with this in mind, I'm currently developing a new project in collaboration with a colleague of mine, Dr. Laura Cole at Northeastern University, in Boston, which is designed to analyze recent and these upcoming potential investments in renewable energy and the inclusivity of these investments across 3 regions of the United States. And we're particularly interested in how they impact Puerto Rico, Massachusetts, where Laura is located, and West Virginia. We will investigate the role of different actors in shaping energy transformations and the power dynamics that are inherent in these transformations to better understand the potential they have for the most vulnerable people, as well as barriers to that kind of inclusion. One of the primary goals of that project is to reveal hidden assumptions and unintended inequities in energy transitions. And to do this, we want to really be careful to include voices of community members who are so often left out of these discussions. So we'll actually be employing this method of Photovoice across these 3 case studies to capture that level of detail. This project is structured around the 3 research questions that you can see on the slide if you're interested, but really focuses on these intersections of disruption, recovery, investment, and the potential for transformation to a more equitable energy future. It's just in its initial stages. We're currently developing the proposal for an interested funder. So I hope we'll have the chance to come back and tell you more about that once we get off the ground. But really excitingly, we've been talking that if with Angie and folks at West Virginia Rivers, that if the project is funded, they'll work with us as one of our community level collaborators. And so we're really thrilled about that. And I'm really thrilled for the chance to then get to sit on a panel with Angie because it's very well timed. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to her and Nico, hear their thoughts on all of this. I'd be delighted to hear any feedback from the audience and answer any questions. And if anything piqued your interest and you'd like to talk more, you have my email and some more information about me. And I will stop there for now.
That's great, Dr. Shinn. I appreciate we all appreciate your presentation very much. Angie and Nicolas, if you could join us, that would be great. We do have this panel, and it happens by happenstance that these people have worked together and are working together on various projects. So hopefully we'll get into that in some detail. Again, I would remind everybody that the audience is definitely a part of this and interactive. We already have a question in the Q&A box, and encourage you all to ask questions either generally or to a particular person. So let me introduce our panelists tonight a little more formally. Angie Rosser is the Executive Director of the West Virginia Rivers Coalition. The West Virginia Rivers, and I did not know this, is the first statewide river advocacy group east of the Rockies. It is the statewide voice for water-based recreation and clean, drinkable, swimmable, and fishable rivers and streams, from headwaters to wherever they flow. And of course, here in West Virginia, we're the headwaters ultimately of the Ohio River, of the Potomac, and who knows what other rivers. Angie probably does. Angie lives along the Elk River and wants to assure that she can swim in a clean river, and also to assure that citizens of West Virginia have clean water. We're also thrilled to be joined by Nicolas Zegre. He is an associate professor of forest hydrology at West Virginia University, and also the director of WVU's Mountain Hydrology Laboratory. This laboratory focuses on aspects of water resources with a particular emphasis on land surface and atmospheric processes, to ultimately understand how our mountain freshwater ecosystems and services respond to these environmental changes and climate change that we're undergoing. Professor studies the interaction between the humans and the environment, and the roles that water plays as a shared experience and the common language between people and for communicating their science. So welcome, Dr. Zegre also. So I'd like to ask our panelists to start off, and we'll start with you first, Angie, if that's okay. Any comments that you'd want to make, follow-ups, questions for Dr. Shinn? So please.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Dr. Jame, for your information. I mean, you're really kind of opening my mind up to how we think about transition, and because typically we've been thinking about fair and equitable transitions for fossil fuel workers and coal communities. And I think you're starting to broaden this out in a way I hadn't thought about. So very interesting. But I guess my first comment, I can't help but remark on how personal this is for me and my neighbors. If I would rotate my screen 90 degrees, you'd see the Elk River that looks beautiful and calm and serene and way down there. But on June 23rd, 2016, it was in my house. Never thought that would happen. I lived outside of the floodplain. I did not have flood insurance. Was assured when I bought my house 15 years ago, the Sutton Dam was going to take care of everything. We would never, Clendenin, which is down the river, we would never flood, has never flooded. And now I'm living in what you described as this kind of dichotomy between vulnerability and resiliency, and kind of despair and hope, because for me, like going through another flood, emotionally, spiritually, financially, is out of the question. I can't even, my mind can't go there. And every time it rains, I feel like my blood pressure rise. So, and I know this is true for my neighbors too. And many of us are in a financial position where, well, where do we go? How do we sell our house? What does relocation mean? But on the other hand, as you described, the response to the flooding disasters we have in West Virginia really bring out the best of what our neighbors in West Virginia has. I heard something about flooding disasters or any kind of disasters, kind of like the response starts with your neighbors and ends with your neighbors. And I saw that happen where places like Clay County, where I live, where we don't have the infrastructure to really support resilience, we were cut off for a long time. So it was really just our neighbors who were around, literally. And then the National Guard talking and working on climate change, we knew we had to localize the issue and make it very relevant. And Nico, you were one of the first people who really helped me think through this. Is how how does something like climate change, that sounds to many West Virginians as kind of an affront to our way of life. It's very controversial, but how does it show up for us? And I'm wondering, Jame, in your work so far, how do you start that conversation, and where are people's consciousness and making connections between something like flooding that it seems like is becoming more of a common phenomenon for us in West Virginia? Are people making that connection to climate and starting to think about the importance of climate action, which is something our organization is trying to figure out what is going to resonate and motivate people? So I'm curious, in your discussion so far, or the work ahead, what are West Virginians thinking?
It's such an important question. And so much of what you just said parallels what I hear from research participants who also lived through the flood, right? Like this constant anxiety every time it rains, this idea, like people were taking lots of photos of abandoned houses, like lots of photos, because it's like this really emotional reminder of what happened, right? And what hasn't happened to, like, in terms of recovery and building resilience. And so I just think your personal experiences parallel community experiences across the state. The question about how people are thinking about climate change, I can't wait to have an answer for. It is so tricky. I've had people in interviews, will talk. I mean, I've had a lot of people cry, right? Like people who seem like tough and hardened, break down crying about the story of the flood, often because they've never told anyone before. And we'll talk and talk. It's very moving. And then I'll say something like, well, what do you think caused it? And I've had people button back up and say, well, you're going to try to get me to talk about climate change, and I'm not interested in that. Now, not to a person, right? But I've had that happen a couple of times. I actually have steered clear of conversations around climate change because I'm of two minds. Like, if we can just talk to people about flooding and what needs to happen, then that gets us somewhat further along. But we can't talk about transformation unless we're talking about the real odds we're up against here, right? I've been working, Michael alluded, and I didn't say this in my talk, though I'm happy to talk about it. I work with some other folks across the state here at WVU, but also at the NASA Fairmont office, and some high school teachers down in Huntington. We've put together this West Virginia Professional Development Climate Change Group. Nico's been working with us some. And what we've done is tried to take a holistic approach to climate change and create activities for high school teachers to implement in their classrooms, because they're up against the odds, right? Like, first of all, everybody's burned out. Second of all, they have no resources. It's not in the state standards, right? So there's no impetus to add it. So we're trying to make it really easy to just take an activity and implement it in the classroom. And the teachers are really keen to do that. And I think their students are, but it's another generation that I think is still resistant. So our mentality is that we just have to talk about it as much as possible. But then I don't always employ that in my own research. So I hope this is something we'll keep talking about, because I've not figured it out.
This raises a lot of questions, but we'd like to give Dr. Zegre a chance to start with his perspective on this, as well as any questions that you might have directly for Jame.
Great. Can you hear me? We're good?
Yes, you're fine.
Jame, great talk. Even though we communicate weekly, we don't always get a chance to see all the other things that we all have going on in our world. So really great to learn more about that work. And also thank you to Tom and Haley for the opportunity to be here as a panelist. So it's interesting because Angie, you mentioned that you have this lived experience that Jame discussed, and up until a few months ago, that would have been abstract for me. But within a 6-week period, my house in Morgantown flooded 3 times, and I'm not in a FEMA floodplain. I am almost at the top of a hill, not quite as far as President Gee and the other important people in town, but high enough on the hill to not be inundated by a rising water table. Yet my house is flooded 3 times. And, we laugh about it because I'm a hydrologist that studies this. And I think the important point here is floods don't discriminate, right? Rich, poor, regardless of who you are and what you think, there is a probability that you could be flooded out. And I think that was very much on the minds of Germany and Belgium during the catastrophic flooding that they had. So really, really important work. One thing that I've been thinking a lot about, Jame and others, is what is policy? Is policy an action? Is policy a response? But what we do understand is that the most effective policy is derived in the environment where people know their strengths and understand their weaknesses, and therefore geographically have a better sense of what the issues are. And of course, this is what you're trying to do. But so much policy is promulgated from the top down, from experts such as ourselves telling people what needs to happen. And so I'm kind of curious, you alluded to this project that you're working on with kind of going from research to policy, with qualitative research. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like in terms of, how do you convert it from qualitative or even quantitative to policy that's meaningful and not just an expert that's telling people what they should do?
Yeah, again, my answer is like the same. I keep hedging, like ask me in a few months, I think, and I'll have a hopefully better answer. We're just in the early stages of this fellowship training, but we're working with a consultant who's an expert in translating science and technology research into policy. And, she's taught us how to like kind of make our research palatable to policymakers. We talk about it has to be effective, but it also has to be efficient, right? They have to be able to pay for it. It has to be equitable. And she talks about it in terms of policy options. So I'm not saying like, look, climate change is upon us and you guys have to do X, Y, and Z. It's like, we're going to keep seeing flooding. The data's there. Nicolas Zegre told us it's true with his models, right? And I've talked to a lot of community members, and this is what they think needs to happen. I see options as X, Y, and Z. What do you think, right? Opening up that dialogue, presenting research-based options, but not necessarily saying like from on high, right? Like nobody wants somebody from the ivory tower to come tell them how to run their town, county, state, whatever it is. So I think taking that very seriously. And the other thing that I think I've realized, I often think, oh, qualitative work, it's not big enough. The sample size isn't big enough. People might not take it seriously. But what it does do is tell really compelling stories, right? And I think that's what policymakers need to hear to justify responses. And so what I'm thinking about now is, okay, so how do I take people that I've spent years building relationships with, right? That I hope I really understand their experiences with flooding. How do I take that and say, okay, this is a potential policy option, and giving voice to those folks, right? Because I've been asking them this question for years. So it's not just me, right? I'm in this lucky, privileged position where somebody might listen to me because of my university affiliation. But I'm really drawing on this, rich community perspective that I hope I have. So that's how I've been thinking about it, but I don't have like X, Y, and Z policy options to talk about yet. Partly because I'm really trying to think about how it's not just flooding. This program has also pushed me to think beyond flooding, right? So how does the work on vulnerability also speak to this work on just transitions and that type of thing? How is it all connected?
That's great. And let me bring in a couple of questions, and I'm going to combine a couple of questions because they kind of have the same thought that all three of you have talked about, which is that there is something unique and special about Appalachia. We think of it as, from Songs of Country Road to, it's home. And we have this history of building in river plains, which is partly because it's fertile farmland and it's not high in the mountains and it's the trade routes. how does that fit into the ability or the willingness to rebuild after these floodings? How does that fit into the hydrology, Nico, from the advocacy point of view? How do we deal with that, Angie? And to go further, would this, you think, be limited to West Virginia, almost heaven, or would it apply to other parts of Appalachia, or even to the states that are partially Appalachia and partially not Appalachia? So I'll let all of you have a shot at that. Jame, I'll pick on you. You want to go first on that?
Sure. Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. One, the rebuilding in the floodplain is a really tricky thing. I agree with Angie that in practice, the idea of rebuilding in the floodplain just seems like a recipe for disaster. We've seen this over and over again in places like New Orleans, right? Where we rebuild and it's destroyed and all of this. But one of the sources of resilience that we found in that work in Greenbrier was the sense of attachment to place, right? Like West Virginians have a deep sense of attachment to their land, their communities, their rivers, right? And so and if a home is destroyed and FEMA assistance comes in, FEMA won't let you rebuild in the floodplain unless you have special, if it's raised to a certain level, things that are expensive potentially, right? So there's some kind of structural things that keep people from rebuilding in the floodplain. But I think the question about whether or not they should be allowed to is more complicated. And I don't have an answer for that, except that I think that's this idea of this dual resilience and vulnerability, right? Like, could it be both? Could it be a source of vulnerability, but also a source of strength for people? We know people down in White Sulphur Spring who were living in a trailer park home that was decimated by the floods. One of the people had lived there his entire life. He was in his 40s. It might not be the home we would all pick for ourselves, but it was his home, right? And somebody built him a new house for free, right? Like up on the hill. It wasn't free, but it was extremely affordable. And he was able to buy it outright after a couple of years. And he's proud of that new house, right? But what did he potentially lose when he lost this connections? I just think it's a complicated answer. So I think we need to make those decisions with a lot of care, is what I'll say. It's not as simple as moving somebody out of a floodplain. And how we do that is another question. In terms of other places, I mean, sure, every place is its own context, right? But in some of the work that inspired this new proposal I'm working on with my colleague Laura at Northeastern is about similarities we've seen in my work in Southern Africa and her work in Puerto Rico. And so I saw the question in the chat that I think you're also drawing from about the differences and similarities between people in these places. And what I'll say is that, of course, every place looks different, but this idea of cascading vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities that build upon one another, right? That you're already struggling for a particular socioeconomic reason, or because of your race, or because of your gender, and that the flood hits and it's just another layer of hardship. It's not new hardship, right? It just elevates the hardship you've already had. And that's a dynamic that I've seen play out in any place that I've worked. And that's kind of the inspiration for looking at some of these case studies across the country to think about similarities and differences. Nico said that floods don't discriminate, and I don't disagree, they don't, but they hit people differently, and they hit them differently because of structural discrimination, right? And so it doesn't discriminate who it hits, but how it hits, we could argue, is discrimination, right? Or bound to that. And so that also plays into some of what we're talking about.
Nico, would you like to add to this?
Sure. Yes, Jame, absolutely. It's really an interesting question is, okay, we know hardened infrastructure is really expensive and doesn't necessarily work. And globally, there's been some really interesting research that has looked at how flood vulnerability actually does increase the higher the dam gets. There is some work done in Europe on that because it gives a false sense of security. And a lot of the hardened infrastructure and engineering, the principles are designed on last century's understanding of how weather and climate work. And so the question of, like, what do we do on the ground increase resilience and reduce vulnerability, I think is a really wide open question. There's been some really interesting work from the United Kingdom that researchers worked with, co-produced knowledge with community members who were impacted by floods. And for their smaller towns in the hinterlands, they actually built these log dams across trees that allowed water to go through. But as the flash floods came down, that their hollers, they hit these log dams and slowed that down. And over time, those log dams broke, but it more gently released that flood water. And so this is a really simple thing to do, right? With logs. Is that going to work everywhere? No. And so I think this is really the frontier of this kind of work, is understanding, like, what does action on the ground actually mean? We know when the government buys people out of their houses, there's systemic inequalities in that. We know that when community members, certain types of members in their communities have to leave, there's nowhere safe for them to go. And so it's a really, really complex issue. And to speak to the importance of Dr. Shinn's work, is the solution is somewhere, but it's absolutely predicated on the need to co-produce knowledge and understanding of vulnerability, and co-produce tools and technology and solutions with the community members. If we don't have that local knowledge to move forward, it's just throwing a lot of money at a really big problem that's never going to get solved.
Angie, you're the person on the panel that's working, if you will, as the community or in the community. How does this science and research that they're doing help you, influence you? What's the way to help communities, groups like the WV Rivers, build this capacity?
Well, we rely heavily, our policy work is driven by science first and foremost, and we don't have the in-house resources to hire our own scientists that we need. So we rely on folks like Jame and Nico to help us understand the science of climate change and hydrology. But what I'm hearing pulling into this conversation that's equally as fascinating and deserves weight is kind of the social science. Gina McCarthy was pointed out at one point, climate change is an ecological problem, but it's a people problem. It's a human problem. Understanding the human dimensions of all of this is where, when Jame talked about intersections and how I see our policy work and how we have to bring things to the legislature of DC, we have to recognize and understand that human element. And Jame talking about the difficulties of rebuilding versus relocation. That is so complicated. I'm thinking of my neighbors on either side of me. Both of them have handed down these homes and properties through generations. On that side, I've got two grown children living on the same property. So it's like generational families where that sense of place and holding our ground, I experienced that in a fierce way. It's I couldn't hardly stand to be here because of all the mud and the stink and the stench and how that was making me sick, but I couldn't leave. I was not going to leave. I was not going to let looters take over my house. So there's something very real about this sense of resilience and ferocity about just wanting to make it work. And I don't know. It's so complicated. Whatever this is going to be expensive. I was in on a conversation about Milton's flood problems and whether to build a flood wall. They are building a flood wall. Very, very, very expensive. Just to even do the engineering, let alone build it and maintain it for decades to come. So it's kind of like when you do the math versus paying people out to move versus building some kind of traditional flood structure, you start to ask questions, but then put on that human dimension of what this mean, what it means to us politically, culturally. It gets very complex. So just kind of have to appreciate that and wade through it, to use a water metaphor. Couldn't resist.
I can't top that metaphor. So let me jump into a different question. We've alluded to the fact that the three of you have worked together. It would seem on first blush that geography and forest hydrology and community groups would not necessarily have anything in common. Give us an idea of how your work informs each other, builds on each other, how you all can work together, and what happens as a result of that. And Nico, I'll ask you to start first on that.
Sure, Michael, thank you for the question. So how do they inform each other? Well, as a scientist and educator at a land grant institution such as WVU, we have the mandate and the responsibility to work on behalf of our community members. Unfortunately, in the scientific industrial complex, where federal research dollars and overhead is kind of more the important thing, that always doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen, I'll just say it doesn't always happen. But speaking from my own experience, coming to West Virginia University and working here, very quickly, I got wind of what West Virginia's rivers has been up to, and then started to ask questions of like, what role do I, as an expert in hydrology and climatology, have in supporting the information that Rivers Coalition or other watershed organizations are doing. And so I think it's really, really critical for academics to look beyond their walls, to get into the communities that they live, and especially at a land grant institution like WVU, an absolute responsibility to engage with communities, including nonprofit groups, to understand what their needs are, and then craft science and action around that collective work together. So again, just kind of speaking from my own experience. And what I can say is I've been heavily influenced by West Virginia Rivers in terms of, the sorts of questions that I've been asking and the work that I've been trying to do. So just a shout out to Angie and her organization. They're super critical for the state of West Virginia.
Angie, that sounds like it's now your turn. Yeah, I mean, working together is essential. It's that plain and simple. I mean, we can't advocate for good, sensible policy without having the science and research around it. And I don't think researchers can see their work applied without putting like voice to it and exposure to it. So, part of what I've been really energized about in these types of partnerships with these folks is like, how do we bring the science to policymakers, into the public in ways they can understand and relate to? That is so important. I mean, you've heard me talk about how this is all personal. We've got to make it personal and relatable to people's everyday lives. And no one's going to read a 40-page journal article. Like, no one's going to do that. So we need, like, I say jokingly, but it's not. It's like we need cartoons. We need ways that we can visualize part of this research that these good folks, brilliant folks work on, and to make sure that we're asking the right questions to solve the problems we're trying to solve. And that's where the research community is so important.
Dr. Shinn?
Yeah, I echo everything that Nico and Angie said. I thought what Nico would say was that it took us 3 or 4 years to write an article together. It's just come out. And that's not for lack of effort. It took a long time to learn each other's languages. And I literally have a document on my computer called like, I'm trying to be a modeler now or something, right? That like, I was trying to understand what Nico was doing. And Nico is an example of an amazing natural scientist who embraces social science and was willing to learn to do that, but not everybody is. And I had to meet him maybe a quarter of the way. I'm not sure I met him halfway. I did my best. But it took us a long time to write that paper, but it's been really fruitful, at least for me, to have that work, but it took time, it took commitment, right? And now we can continue to learn with one another. The connection to West Virginia rivers and other advocacy groups is like, I know, like, what's the point if we're not doing that? It's a no-brainer. No one's going to read the articles. I wouldn't read the articles if I wasn't writing them, right? Like we produce those for other academics. They're useful in that context, but I don't expect somebody in Raynell is going to read the article. It's not written for them, right? But the work is for them. And so how do we then get the work to where it needs to be? And I think it's through the amazing work of West Virginia Rivers and the other groups in the state doing great stuff.
Dr. Shinn, you alluded towards the end of your presentation about seeing community transformation as being something more than just jobs for the coal industry, but that it's something broader. I've got a couple of questions that kind of get into that. One is this flooding just kind of a result of just being in floodplain area, or are there underlying socioeconomic type of situations? And given both the geography and the place, and if there are other factors involved, where do we begin to get from this idea of community resilience and mobilizing our neighbors and getting the faith groups involved before FEMA can get there into real community transformation? So what would you see as kind of the steps to doing that?
We have to transform the structures. So this is not the job of the communities. It's not the fault of the communities, right? It is structural issues. When HUD is selling homes in a floodplain to low-income families, we have a structural issue, right? When people are told by FEMA that they no longer live in the floodplain, so they drop their expensive insurance, we have a structural issue that happened in 2016. People who were flooded had recently been told they no longer needed to carry their insurance. That also means that federal government and other governing bodies need to be relying on good science, right? And up-to-date science, like Nico alluded to, right? Sometimes we're using outdated models at this point. It's so complex. But I think to leave the onus on communities just further amplifies the injustice, right? Because I don't want to make this overly political, but if we think about the social and environmental toll of the extractive industries versus what came back to our state, we've got a great imbalance. And so we need to get good work, right? I believe in President Biden's idea that we need good union jobs for people who were working in the coal mines and auxiliary industries, right? 100% I'm on board with that. But we're not going to go from maintaining the status quo of what we have now to true transformation that's a more equitable future if we can't transform some of the systems that are at play. And that's deep, deep work. And I think it's going to take all of us, scientists, advocacy folks, communities, right? But I don't want to end here. I don't want to suggest that I think it's the job of the communities to do that work. They have a super important role to play, but it goes much, much deeper and much bigger than that.
Dr. Zegre, would you like to add to that?
I won't add to that. I think Jame covered it. It's structural, and deconstruction and rebuild is what we need to do. So.
And anything additional, Angie, from the community advocacy side?
Well, I just appreciate what Jame says about not putting it on the community. And I mean, because when you're in community and you're dealing with just layers and layers of challenges, it's like, what's the word? You can't see the trees through the forest, or you just can't see it. You can't quite see the bigger picture. So to have people working on kind of those systemic issues and helping to connect storytelling to those structural things, that's important work. And you can't ask people who are just struggling day to day to figure all that out, or to even, to eat, like, not, I don't want to say not understand it, but just not see it. in that way. But, I think there's so many ways to do sort of the structural kind of confrontation that needs to happen, but to do it in a way that respects people's lived experiences and the complexity of everyday lives in West Virginia.
Okay, we're getting kind of towards the end of our hour, but we have talked briefly about the West Virginia Climate Change Professional Development Group. So I would ask Jame, just quickly tell us what that is. And I would also add, since I know it's education involved, there's been many comments in the question and answer about people that are interested in the curricula, interested in helping out with that. So I would encourage them to email Dr. Shinn directly to get involved with that. But if you could just kind of give us the brief outline of what that group does.
Sure, I'd be happy to. This is a group started by Dr. Catherine Williamson in WVU Physics, who's an amazing science outreach educator, as well as physicist. And the group has a few different projects that we work on, and I tried to answer some comments individually, and I gave a couple of people the website, but I don't know, Michael, if there's a way to share that more broadly. I don't see a chat that I can add to.
No, there isn't. Just that's why I encourage people to email you if they want to get involved with that.
So, or Google the West Virginia Professional Development Climate Change Group. Some of it, so we have a couple of different branches that we're doing. So if you're a teacher, we're trying to create two things: a network in a space for teachers to talk to one another, because often we actually think teachers are learning much more from one another than they are from us. So we're trying to create online spaces like this for teachers to dialogue and brainstorm with one another about how to teach climate change that we're just kind of facilitating. We're about to offer a formal course for continuing education credits through Fairmont State. So if you're a teacher or you know a teacher who might be interested in taking that course, it will be asynchronous online for the most part. I'd love to share information with that about people. The other thing we're trying to do, like I mentioned, is create resources for teachers that are just like delivered to them that they can implement. So on our website, you'll see a list of resources, and we try to take both a natural science and social science perspective to help teachers think holistically about the human and environmental impacts. So you'll see things on the carbon journey, including a carbon journey game created by our colleague Josh Revels at NASA, and ecological carbon footprint calculator to think about our own intersections with the carbon cycle, right? So we try to take this holistic approach. Nico has some projects through his Climate Link project. I don't know if there's time, but he might want to talk about that, where he's also creating resources for educators that we're trying to link to some of this work. And then the third thing we've been doing for the first time, and we hope it will be annual, is that we're running a public service announcement contest. So high schoolers across the state submitted radio and video PSAs, and there was a competition. We did this right around Earth Day last year, and we selected a few winners, and they were broadcast like on hundreds of stations across the state. And it was so fun to meet these students, and they did such an amazing job. And the mentality there is like, let people hear about climate change in West Virginia from students in West Virginia. So the idea is that they're taking what they're learning in that classroom and filtering it into these PSAs. And we'll be doing that again this year. So if anybody's interested, we need judges for that. If anybody has resources they want to help us with the PSA contest, then there's opportunities there. So send me an email if you're interested.
Great. Thank you for all that great information. And we are kind of at the end of our program now. So what I like to do at the end of these is to ask each of our panelists to give us a 30-second takeaway about communities and the work of communities in this whole just transitions kind of situation. So I'll turn it to Nico, and then to Angie, and then I'll ask Dr. Shinn for any closing she'd like us to leave with as well.
I'll just start by saying that I am optimistic and hopeful that we will figure this out, especially as having two young native West Virginians in my household. There's lots of reason to do that. But in closing, I think what is critical is to have a bottom-up approach meet the top-down approach. There's data, there's knowledge, there's information, there's institutions at play that work down towards the community. But as we've discussed, it's really critical to go from the bottom up and meet at that junction and again, kind of co-produce these ideas and solutions together. So super fascinating work, Dr. Shinn and Angie, thank you for all your great work, and everybody on the call for doing this together.
I would just say we need more of what's happening here, you know, one that's being modeled in terms of like making the connections between the research, science, and community and policy, and more of that. And I would just encourage everyone who's tuned in tonight. Well, first of all, thanks for joining us this evening, and you know, keep connected to the Center on Climate Change. It sounds like resources are coming, and to help inform further conversations. I think Jame started that out. We just like need to be talking about that. And what I've read about the climate communication science was just those dinner, you know, around conversations around the dinner table is like where it all begins. And the more people feel like we can talk about this, the more we're going to make progress.
Dr. Shinn, what would you like us to think about as we leave?
I wouldn't spend my life thinking about this stuff if I didn't think transformation was both necessary and possible. And that's what motivates me every day, and conversations like this. And so I just echo gratitude for bringing us all together and for the work that everybody on the call is doing. And I'm sure so many people who have Zoomed in tonight are also doing this work in their households and communities. And so I think we need to kind of always operate from that space as much as possible to work together, be, you know, grateful to each other for the work we're able to do. And it's hard work, and it's going to take a long time, and it's really complicated. But I think Nico's point is a good one, that I remain hopeful that it's possible.
Thank you very much. We'd like to thank our panelists, Angie Rosser and Nicolas Zegre. Your contributions and comments tonight were excellent. Dr. Shinn, thank you for taking the time out to talk to us about your work and about community resilience. We are, again, appreciative of our co-sponsors, the West Virginia College of Law Center for Energy and Sustainable Development, and the West Virginia Climate Alliance. We're the West Virginia Center on Climate Change. Our next program that's scheduled is October 26th with Dr. Julio Friedman, who will be talking about carbon removal, both from the ambient atmosphere, from point sources, and from the energy economy as well. So I believe that the links are up for that to get enrolled, but we do encourage you to keep an eye out for that, and please join us if you're able to do that. And lastly, we'd like to thank the people that participated and came. Your questions were excellent and contributed to our conversation. And again, we thank our panelists, we thank Dr. Shinn, and we thank all of you for attending. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thanks, Michael.